Let's discuss the most controversial nuclear power plant in the world. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to discuss Astravyets, the new nuclear power plant in Belarus. It's also the first nuclear power plant that that country has had, and yet it is enormously controversial. Why? Because of its location. Minsk is 150 kilometers away from Astravyets, and yet the nuclear power plant is just 16 kilometers from Lithuania's border and around 40 kilometers from the capital Vilnius. So it's much closer to the Lithuanians, should anything go wrong, than it is for the Belarusian people. And to put that in perspective, if there was another Chernobyl-style accident at the Astravyets power plant, the exclusion zone of Chernobyl today would encompass much of modern-day Vilnius, making the Lithuanians deeply anxious about this new construction. Now, a disclaimer before I go on. I am a nuclear specialist. I don't talk about it much in this channel, and I'm trained mostly in nuclear weapons, but I do know about reactors as well. And I'm going to give what I think is a fair and balanced assessment of Lithuania's complaints. There are certain things that I think are overblown, but also a couple of areas in which I am deeply concerned. So I'm going to talk about the positive things first. Well, the nuclear power plant itself is a beautiful modern design. It's a VVER 1200 design. It has a Generation 3 reactors, which have a lot of passive safety systems built in. Passive being things that require no auxiliary systems, no new controls, no one to hit any emergency buttons or anything like that. If the operators were completely asleep at the wheel and something terrible happened, how resilient would the reactor be? Well, it has a negative void coefficient, which is a very important feature. It means that it's self-sustaining in terms of powering down. It has resilient containment facilities. So if there's a meltdown, it'll just pull up in a particularly secure location, won't contaminate the surrounding area. There are seismic controls, so it's designed to withstand a 1 in 10,000 year seismic event. It's also arguably designed to withstand a direct impact from a 747, although so is the Twin Towers, so take that for what you will. But looking at all of the different options there, I think it has superb passive safety features. Also has some excellent modern day auxiliary systems. So for example, boric acid injectors, a massive overpressure protection system. It's a advanced pressure water reactor model. So overall, it's totally incomparable to what happened at Chernobyl. And what happened at Chernobyl absolutely could not happen at this reactor. This reactor has only been around since the 90s. It first started in Japan, I think was the first place to have it live. They're operating in many countries now around the world. And I personally will be happy to work in one and live in the area in perpetuity. That the risk is truly negligible. However, it's not really the point. There is a convention called the Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment for Transboundary Context, or the ESPOO Convention. And what that means is, if you are going to build a new reactor somewhere and it could potentially impact other countries, you must collaborate with those countries to agree on sites that are appropriate. Belarus failed to do that. It broke international law to put a nuclear power plant as far away from its own people as possible giving total disregard to the Lithuanians who would be on the brunt of anything going wrong, which doesn't give the Lithuanians any confidence that you care much about safety in the first place, and doesn't give the international community confidence that you're capable of running a nuclear power plant in a safe and appropriate way. And because of this fact, because of this total breach of international law, the Lithuanians are fully entitled to assume the worst. So they are violently opposed to this, and they're pursuing protests in all kinds of international spheres. Actions that I fully support, and also that they have pledged not to purchase any of the power produced at this nuclear power facility, which is entirely understandable. I think the Poles also have that position as well. The question then also arises around nuclear proliferation. If you've got a nuclear power plant for the first time, is it possible that the Belarusian government will divert fissile material to perhaps military purposes, try and produce a clandestine bomb? Well, on that score, I have a high degree of confidence. First of all, Belarus has ratified the additional protocols in the NPT with strong IAEA inspections, very intrusive, gram for gram kind of accounting for the fissile material. And also the reactor design itself isn't the type of reactor you would normally construct if you were looking at dual-use military purposes. So it's very hard to sort of produce weapons-grade plutonium from this type of reactor. You're only using low-enriched uranium in this type of reactor. The fuel is being sourced from Russia. So all of that gives indication that this will just be used for power. It won't be diverted for military purposes. You won't see a clandestine Belarusian nuclear weapons program as a consequence of that. So that's on the positive side. But again, on the negative side, and this is what I think is the single biggest issue now, is to do with spent fuel. You put your fuel rods into a reactor, you let the process run for a period of time, and then when the impurities are such that it's no longer efficient, you pull out the fuel rods and you have to store them somewhere. Now, quite often countries will export them to other places who then put them through spent fuel reprocessing facilities to recycle them into new rods for further use. Well, that was the plan of Belarus. And that's what they declared in November of 2019 in Vienna, when the Belarusian government announced that they would conclude a separate arrangement with Russia to export their spent fuel out of Belarus to have it sent to reprocessing facilities in Russia. Well, as of now, and remember this nuclear power plant is currently operating, no such agreement exists. The Belarusian government in April of this year has said that they're going to be storing their spent fuel on their own territory, and that sites are being sourced for this process right now. So they don't have a credible plan for managing their nuclear waste, and it's totally unclear, given their track record to date, that they'll consult with the surrounding countries as to what to do about it. And it's entirely plausible that Lithuania will be on the brunt end of that as well. So Belarus has really been sticking its finger at the rest of the international community, in particular the Lithuanians, when it comes to their own nuclear program. It's not in the spirit of international cooperation and collaboration that such a sensitive subject like nuclear power would demand. They did not provide under the convention alternative sites that is required under international law, alternative sites that no doubt would have been further away from Lithuania's border and closer towards Belarus's capital itself, which is entirely appropriate. So if you're having a nuclear power program, it's obviously incumbent upon you to make sure that all of the elements of the nuclear fuel cycle to which you're engaged, the power production, the spent fuel, the reprocessing, all of that is being managed appropriately to minimize the conceivable impact on other countries. But Belarus has been doing this in a totally reckless and reprehensible way to put the Lithuanians, the ones suffering all of the negative consequences, without actually benefiting from being a Lithuanian reactor. And finally, Just to end on a positive note, I have read the reports of safety and inspection. The IAEA has done intrusive inspections at this site that other international experts from the United States, Netherlands, Brazil, other countries around the world have been there as well. They wrote an extensive report which the Belarusian government has made available to me. I've read it in its entirety, and it does talk about this site as being a model of safety for nuclear power. It has a few recommendations, but they're purely process. And indeed, they talk about lessons learned from this experience that could actually instruct other reactors around the world in terms of best practice. So at the moment, this seems to be a safe, modern, well-run nuclear reactor. However, Belarus broke international law to do it. They did not provide alternative sites. They promised the international community their spent fuel was going to be exported to Russia, but just 2 years later, with the reactor now online, that is not the case. It is totally unclear what they're intending to do with the spent fuel facilities and where they're going to store them and how. Is it going to be next to Minsk? I find that deeply unlikely. Far more probable they're going to be pushing it towards the border just with the reactor itself. And so I completely understand Lithuania's stance on this. And as someone who is a strong proponent of nuclear power, I think nuclear power is an essential element for combating climate change. It has the only means of producing baseload power at scale for places that are densely populated without having greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's a critical element of our future climate change strategy. It is critical that you get buy-in from the civil society. And when governments make decisions that undermine the sovereignty of their surrounding countries in order to push nuclear power to the fringes of their own borders, then that grossly undermines the reputation of nuclear power worldwide as it is today. So that's my view. I don't know what is likely to happen. I think that there will be further international legal arguments against Belarus. I think the Astravyets nuclear power plant, if they can't export power to the EU, its value is going to be deeply undermined. It costs some $11 billion to construct. Very hard to imagine it all being used domestically. So unclear what Belarus does. This could end up being a giant white elephant that, Belarus argues that it reduces their dependency on Russian gas and things like that. But, unless they can export the power elsewhere, it's going to be economically unviable. And if I was in Lithuania's position, this is exactly the stance that I would take. So kudos to the Lithuanian government for doing that. Belarus really needs to give much greater consideration as to how they're going to reconstitute confidence in this power reactor if they're ever going to get international acceptance. And that means inviting Lithuania in to participate in making sure that there's appropriate oversight and running of this facility. But given the relationship with Belarus and the rest of the international community right now, that seems deeply unlikely. So that's my view. If you have your own perspective, I would love to hear it down below. I know this is in the consciousness of Lithuanians, but I want to bring it to the attention of the rest of the world as well. What do you think of nuclear power? Do you think it's critical for the future? Do you think that Belarus was totally reprehensible in the way it went about this? Or is it just, their own borders, their own rights, they can do what they like? Give us your views below. If you haven't already, like this video, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.